I checked just about every hour of every day for a week to see if the next chapter was available. I thought about bringing it up with my friends, but I wasn't completely convinced it wasn't a prank, and I refused to give them satisfaction. I tried to go back and listen to the other chapter again, having realised, after the initial shock wore off, that even the first chapter, which I am now embarrassed to admit bored me, was exactly how the first 30 years of my life had been. But that was also unavailable. Exactly 1 week after I finished the last chapter, the next chapter became available. I was simultaneously terrified and excited to press the play button. Benjamin was filled with a terrified excitement as he launched into the next chapter from the book that strangely mirrored his life. He'd written about it online, wondering if anyone else would offer some logical explanation for what he had been experiencing, but so far, nobody had. Almost nobody believed his story was anything other than pure fiction, and those who did believe his story were somewhat crazy themselves. He'd spent the last week obsessing over the idea that an audiobook could narrate his life with such vivid detail, and had obsessed further still about the claw marks left on his door, and that last line from the previous chapter about the horrors he would soon face. I'm not sure I would use the word obsessing necessarily. However, I had been thinking a lot about the implications of this strange recording, particularly the part about the horrors that I would soon face, and I think any homeowner would be pissed about the vandalism to their front door, especially since it's not something a can of paint can fix. But were the two related? That much wasn't clear to me. They say that correlation shouldn't be confused with causation, and that seemed to be what was happening here. Could whoever was narrating this story have vandalised my door, or was it simply a coincidence? Moreover, with regards to the final line of the last chapter, was this story now telling the future as well as the present? Was this an ominous message meant to frighten me? Or could it, perhaps, be a warning? I noticed that I could pause and resume the life of Benjamin whenever I felt like it, and the story would continue as if I hadn't paused it at all. I could, for example, pause the audiobook, take a shower, and resume it, and the narrator would say something like, Benjamin returned from the shower and resumed the audiobook, curious to discover if he'd missed anything. The buttons to move ahead or rewind were greyed out, and the progress bar at the top never moved, so whatever I heard could only be heard once I had no idea how much further I could go before the chapter ended. I did try to record a part of it, wondering if I could share it online to see if anyone recognised the voice of the narrator, but every recording I tried ended up with mostly just muffled static. This is what I managed to record. I found myself listening to The Life of Benjamin at every opportunity I could. The writing was so eloquent, and the descriptions so vivid that it gave me an appreciation for the beauty of the world I lived in. It described the scent of the morning that I normally wouldn't give a second thought about, and the way it described the city streets, working like veins as they carried blood towards the heart of downtown Salt Lake. It even accurately expressed my frustration when I was cut off in traffic, and my anxiety as I prepared a presentation at work. The narrator expertly summed up my developing appreciation of The Life of Benjamin with a single line. For the first time in his life, Benjamin felt truly heard. It wasn't long before the ominous message was nothing more than a bad memory, one I was beginning to doubt. Although the value of this audiobook had already made itself clear, and I was already enamoured with it, a new experience I hadn't yet considered quickly doubled that value in an instant. As Benjamin made his way home, enjoying the warm breeze coming through the open window, and again marvelling at the shades of colour being drawn across the sky by the setting sun, he noticed something that gave him pause. Strange. I had just been thinking about the beauty of the sunset, but nothing had given me pause, except for maybe that line in the story. A discarded shoe on the side of the road, near the jogging path that ran adjacent to the canal, lay in the dry dirt. I looked towards the jogging path and slowed the car down. It was a little hard to make out, but there really was something lying in the dirt. I pulled over and got out of the car, jamming an earbud into my left ear so I could continue the story. He approached the discarded sneaker with apprehension, not knowing until that moment that the sneaker belonged to Colton Fisher, an 8-year-old boy whose parents were on the phone with the police that very moment, desperately describing their missing son. "The hell?" I said to myself. I looked around for signs of a kid missing their shoe. There was something about the dirt, though. The pattern there. As he searched around for signs of movement, his gaze drifted downward, towards the canal. I then noticed a red shape in the running water. I crawled down the side of the canal and stepped into the water. I had wondered if the red was maybe part of a shirt or heart, but as I approached, I noticed then that the red shape was moving with the water, like ink. It was blood. I hurried faster as I watched the water become a deeper shade of red. I stumbled on a rock and fell down, splashing myself in the face and covering most of my body in the dirty canal runoff. I pushed myself up and felt the rock at my feet give a little. It wasn't a rock. It was a foot. I plunged my hands in the cold water and felt the body of a child. He pulled the body of Colton Fisher out of the water and scrambled back up the rocky side of the canal. He had never been formally trained to perform CPR, but he'd learned enough about it to try, all while screaming for help. I hadn't even realised I was screaming until the narrator in my ear told me, but he was, of course, right as rain. I compressed the boy's chest a few times, then blew air into his mouth, bellowing for someone to help. Moments later, I heard a car stop behind me and a car door slam. A woman's voice approached. She was already on the phone with 911. I asked the woman if she knew CPR, and she said she did, so I told her to switch me and I'd talk to the police. She did so without hesitation. Minutes later, an ambulance showed up. I was desperately listening to the narrator in my ear, hoping for direction, or at least a sign of whether or not Colton was even alive, but he seemed to be deliberately avoiding spoilers. The paramedics took over immediately and continued CPR. They pulled out tools and instruments and began to work faster and more efficiently than any other team I'd seen. "I've got a pulse," I heard one say to another, and I felt dizzy with relief. A police officer showed up and asked the woman, whose name I learned was Karen Harvey, courtesy of the audiobook, and me a series of questions. I answered the questions, deliberately leaving out the part about my own personal narrator, giving me the heads up that there was a kid in the canal with a head wound moments away from death, and soon found myself driving home. I showered, changed, then went immediately back to listening to The Life of Benjamin. I'd had to put it on hold while the police were asking their questions. Still coming down from the rush of adrenaline that came with pulling a child from the brink of death, Benjamin resumed his audiobook with a new sense of wonder. Had he not been listening at that precise moment, there was no doubt in his mind that Colton Fisher would have died that day. It was true. There's no way that kid would have survived if I hadn't been listening to that audiobook on the way home from work. The police said it looked like he'd somehow fallen into the canal and knocked his head against a rock, possibly after being spooked by an animal. Had I been even 5 minutes later, he would have drowned. It wasn't until that moment that I finally recalled the moment just before noticing the blood in the water and the rush of adrenaline kicked in. The shoe had been on the ground, but nearby were a series of grooves in the dirt, like the tracks of a large animal. There would be no way to know for sure, but I would bet my life that the marks on my door and the marks in the dirt were the same. And then there was this unnerving feeling I'd felt just before I saw the blood, like I was being watched. And then there was this unnerving feeling I'd felt just before I saw the blood, and even more unnerving still was that feeling hadn't gone away. In fact, it hadn't dissipated at all since I'd left the canal. Benjamin knew he would likely never discover the source of the tracks in the dirt, nor the connection, if any, there was between them and the claw marks on his door. For now, he was content knowing that his actions had saved the life of a child, and that, for all intents and purposes, was good. Again, the narrator hit the nail on the head. Well, almost. It strangely glossed over my sense of being watched. I climbed into bed, then got up and locked my bedroom door for safe measure. The sense of unease Benjamin felt was fleeting with his exhaustion. As he climbed back into bed, a renewed sense of safety from the locked door covering him like a blanket he began to doze off. I was just about to sleep when a sound from down the hallway pulled me from the brink. What was that sound? The house settling probably, or even more likely, my imagination. I closed my eyes again and began to drift, when again I heard that sound, louder now, closer. It was an odd padded tapping sound. The first image my mind conjured up was from my childhood, specifically when the family dog would walk across the linoleum. I took a deep breath and turned on the bedside lamp. Nighttime does wild things to one's memory. In the daytime, I would have quickly shrugged it off as a sound of the house settling, and that would have been the end of it. I thought for a moment, then put the earbud in my ear. Maybe the narrator could tell me what that sound was. The excitement from the day, it seemed, had manifested itself in wild imagery from his mind's eye of large monsters lying in wait in the dark. Of course, he would tell himself in the morning this really was nothing more than the house settling, noises he'd heard dozens of times before and had quickly disregarded. I laid back down, leaving the lamp beside me turned on, and allowed myself to drift back to sleep. The last thing I recall thinking before sleep finally came was the memory of the previous chapter echoing through my head. The horror that Benjamin was about to face was just beginning, and again, that uneasy feeling that I was being watched.